promises to be a very interesting and stimulating program. One of the elements of the vision for the John Cook School of Business is to make an impact on this region. Today's program is the second in a series calling attention to the fact that large school districts in our region are facing challenges in providing the kinds of educational experiences needed for a thriving regional economy. Through the support of Rick Singfield, former chairman of Dimensional Fund Advisors, founder of the Show Me Institute, St. Louis University trustee, member of the Cook School Executive Advisory Board, and our alum, we are pleased to present today's program. And I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Podgorski, professor of economics at the University of Missouri in Columbia and a member of the Show Me Institute board, to introduce today's speaker. Please join me in welcoming Mike.
It's a great pleasure to have Professor James Guthrie here today. Before I start talking about Jim, because I'll forget about other things I'm supposed to mention, pick up some materials on the Show Me Institute and in the back table, and we'd love to have you as a member. Well, Jim Guthrie is truly Mr. School Finance. I'm so pleased to have him here today. Jim has written, here's his video. This is like a phone book, okay? So, I mean, we could spend a whole hour on this, but he's published 13 books in the area of school finance, and there's a 14th in the works, hundreds of papers in the area. He's testified in over 40 school finance cases, and has been a consultant on school finance to virtually every state in the union. Earlier in this week, he was meeting with the governor of New Hampshire, and they're trying to craft a constitutionally appropriate, if you will, constitutionally friendly school finance system. He's the editor of the Peabody Journal of Education. He's former dean of the Ed School at UCal Berkeley. Came to Peabody College in the mid-90s and became chair of their Ed Admin program, which at the time was basically off at the bottom, off the chart at the bottom in terms of rankings. In the latest rankings of U.S. News and World Report, the department that Jim chairs was ranked #1 in the U.S. in Ed Admin, graduate Ed Admin training. Peabody College was ranked #2 overall. So not only is Jim a leading scholar, he's built just a juggernaut of research at Peabody College. So it's with great pleasure we welcome Dr. Guthrie to talk about a really vexing issue here. This issue of school finance is just a mess, and it's being litigated all over the place, and we really, this is going to be a very interesting talk from a real expert in the area. So without further ado,
Thank you, Mike. Like I assume most everyone in this audience, I'm introduced with some frequency, though not always so nicely. But as I sat and listened to Mike, I couldn't help but reflect on an introduction which was far less fulfilling for me. I had a midlife crisis about 25, 30 years ago. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I already owned a Porsche, so I couldn't do that. So I decided I'd run for public office in what was then my hometown of Berkeley, California. And friends advised me not to run for public office because they said that my middle-of-the-road views, when cast against the background of Berkeley politics, would make me appear to be remarkably conservative, and that I would certainly fail. I said, well, I'll run anyway, and I did. But in the course of running, I was asked to address the high school, Berkeley High School, very big school, And I didn't want to. I had been a high school science teacher. It was the hardest, honest work I'd ever done in my life. And I really didn't look forward to addressing these high school youngsters. But I acquiesced and I went. And I even got there early because I'm a Virgo. So at the last minute, the young man who was supposed to introduce me came huffing and puffing up to the auditorium. He said, "Oh, Mr. Guthrie, I'm supposed to introduce you, and I don't know anything about you," which was exactly what I had thought the minute I looked at him. And I said, "Look, just keep it short." I said, "The briefer it is, the happier we'll all be. Well, let's just move on." He said, "Okay, I think I've got it." And he walked to a lectern such as this. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce you to a man about whom I'm told the less said, the better." And it was all uphill from then on. Now, I won office in Berkeley. I had 35,000 more votes than the mayor had. I thought that this was a turning point in Berkeley's history, that we would henceforth cut a path into the future which would blaze a trail for every other city in the United States, and that just within days I would be in the White House as president. What I didn't realize is that by virtue of being elected to public office in Berkeley, I had guaranteed I'd never hold office anywhere else in the entire world. But in my career, I had been a teacher, and that was vexing. I had come out of a major university where they told me that, as I was a science teacher, that each week you wanted to have an experiment, and I tried that. And then I was always put off by the fact that the teacher in the room next to me, who taught precisely what I taught, he showed a film every day and he made twice as much money as I did. I don't understand this. Then later, I was a school board member, and the teachers' representatives always said, "Well, we aren't in it for the money." And then whenever we bargained each year, the first thing they asked for was more money. I just had trouble putting it together. So eventually, I became interested in this topic of education finance. And what I've come to see, of course, is that there really isn't a field of education finance. You cannot talk about finance these days without very quickly getting into major issues of fundamental policy. The amount of money involved in the funding of K-12 schools is so staggering that both the generating that revenue and distributing that revenue immediately throws you into arenas of intense conflict. So let me begin to address this vexing question of how much do we really need to spend. I'll give you the answer now. Nobody knows. But we can approximate it, and we can think about it in different ways. I understand that a predecessor up here at this lectern was a friend and colleague of mine, Rick Hanushek, from Stanford University. And Rick's research is fundamental to our increasing understanding of the leverage that good education can give a youngster, and for that matter, an entire society, on success. Among the things for which there is less and less doubt is the significance in the life of a student of a good teacher. Now, this may be like, I've heard it said that if fish were social scientists, the last thing in the world they would discover is water. And it may be for those social scientists looking at schooling to determine that a good teacher makes a difference is to pursue the obvious. But for a long time, it was not easy statistically to display the effect of a teacher. Now it's becoming, with different data sets and different methods, it's becoming clear that teachers actually make a difference. And if one is sufficiently fortunate to have an effective teacher 3, 4, 5 years in a row, that gives one a terrific boost in terms of actual achievement. But the converse, regrettably, is also true. A youngster who, for a series of years, has a bad teacher is put at a substantial disadvantage. But Rick Hanushek, these are findings which he is discovering and reaffirming, and the overall significance of education generally is one which his research is fundamental in coming to understand. So I don't question the utility for individuals or for society of a good education system. That's what we want. But it is not easy to get it. So let me start now, and I assure you I'll finish in plenty of time for questions. Here's a modern day parable. Once there existed a powerful and well-intentioned and wealthy nation. The people and their representatives decided that the nation's children should learn more in school. In order to achieve this goal, for 50 years the nation continually spent more money on its schools, employed more people to work in its schools, and strove mightily to ensure that these resources were equitably distributed to all schools and to all children. The nation even provided more money to schools that educated disabled children, or children of poor parents, or from poor neighborhoods. The nation also experimented with multiple means for making its schools more effective. But alas, little of this national effort seemed successful. Student achievement in mathematics and reading did not change much, and the gap between middle class and poor children persisted. What was this powerful and wealthy nation to do? That's where we are. For more than a half century, the United States has striven intensely and earnestly to render its schools better. Now, perhaps it hasn't always done so in the most rational manner. Perhaps there are other strategies we should have tried, and we can talk about all of that. But one of the things it's not easy to say is that we have failed in this quest for better schools because we didn't allocate them sufficient resources. As I'll show you in just a little bit, for the last half century, there's hardly been a time when what we spend on schools has not outstripped inflation. There's hardly been a time when we haven't increased that amount year after year after year. But let's have a little background here. Let's just talk about expenditures generally. Over here in the right-hand corner of this slide, you see total gross domestic product in excess of $13 trillion a year. This was 2 years ago. $13 trillion. In the last 2 years, it has not gone up dramatically. We've not had the dramatic growth we have in various times. So it's probably $13.5 trillion today, but it's not staggeringly increased over these figures. Now, when you look at total government expenditures, you see that approximately a third of the economy in the United States runs through the public sector, 2/3 through the private sector. The federal government outspends by 30–40%. The federal government outspends all other levels of government together. And you'll see that when we look at specific government expenditures, both federal, state, and local, that health expenditures outstrip education. But education is a big part of this. This is 2 years ago, and the K-12 expenditures nationally were almost $518 billion then, and other, which is mostly post-secondary, was about $118 billion. So in today's, when we look at it in the last 2 years, K-12 spending actually has increased quite rapidly. It's of note, even in an economy that's somewhat turning down. K-12 spending is getting very close now to $550 billion a year. Another way to look at it is every operating school day, we spend about $3.3 billion to operate schools in the United States. $3.3 billion every day. In this year, education outstripped military expenditures, defense expenditures. I'm not sure that is true now. I find it baffling to try to get through the Pentagon budget and find out what is recurring and what is allocated for the war in Iraq and so forth. So I can't easily say that K-12 spending outstrips defense spending. But I can easily say that when you put higher education in the mix, the United States spends more on education generally than it does defense. When you look at, I've had the unfortunate experience of being on radio and being on Rush Limbaugh's show. I went because I just wanted to see what it was like. I really, and I wouldn't go again. It wasn't easy. But one of the things he said was that the United States has its values all upside down, and that we spend too much on things that are trivial. I was sort of tempted to agree with that. And then he said, you know, we spend so much more on gambling, and we spend on cosmetics, and we spend on alcohol than we do on education. Isn't that troublesome? I said, well, I'm not so sure it's true. And it isn't true. Here you see, for example, alcoholic beverages don't come up to match education. If I had cosmetics, I could show you that that's actually rather small, too. So the United States has made a substantial, historically and presently, the United States has made a substantial investment in education. It usually runs about 6% of gross domestic product as a percent. That's more than most large nations spend. I'm not here to say it's enough. I don't know that. I am here to say that relatively speaking, it is a large amount, and it seldom deviates from that. Let me talk a little bit more about actual spending. Here is a chart which displays per pupil spending, adjusted. Actually, these are 2003 dollars. This is, in a sense, 5 years out of date, but I'll bring it up to date. This is spending in constant dollars, 2003 dollars, and it bridges more than a century, actually. And what you will see in this graphing is that it's virtually a never-ending upward slope of spending on schools, per pupil spending. This is by each child, so it's not in the aggregate. You can't say, oh, of course spending went up because the number of pupils went up. This is adjusted for that. Except for the 5-year period at the end of the first Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, the 5 years from the end of his administration into the early years of the Clinton administration, school spending regularly went up. These were somewhat recessionary times then, and it didn't go up. But if I had brought this up to date and made a projection for 2008, the amount we spend today per pupil nationwide is approximately $10,000. There are some states that spend substantially more than that. Connecticut, New Jersey, New York are approaching $13,000, $14,000 per pupil per year. When last I knew anything about Missouri, it was somewhat under that. What does this money go for? Well, over time, what it has gone for is salaries. It's gone to purchase humans. It's gone to pay people. So the bottom line here is a tracing over almost the last quarter of a century of the flow of pupils in the system. And you'll see that over that 25-year period, enrollment has grown approximately 10–12%. Whereas the number of employees in the system has grown much faster than that. The number of teachers has grown by 130%, and the number of employees other than teachers, in addition to teachers, has grown about 145%. Who are these people not teachers? The easy thing to say is, well, they're administrators, but that is not accurate. Really, the number of school principals and superintendents and central office employees has not increased dramatically at all. As a matter of fact, for another day, another debate, another set of questions, I would argue that actually education is under-administered by most comparisons with the military or the private sector. There are very few the ratio of administrators to teachers is actually something that most private sector firms hiring individuals of comparable qualification would never tolerate. But who are these people? I have to tell you, I don't really know myself. There are probably some professors of educational administration in the audience who maybe could help answer that question. Checker Finn, a controversial policy commentator and public intellect, Checker Finn describes the growth of these people who are not teachers as the blob. They certainly do, these are reading specialists, mathematics specialists, coaches, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, school community liaison workers, librarians, information technicians, etc. So it's a lot of growth there. So we are spending the money on people is what we're doing. What point do I want to make here? We're not spending it on technology. That's really not where this spending growth is taking place. This is one of the most labor-intensive undertakings imaginable. If the telephone company hadn't learned to automate all these calls, about every person in the United States would be a telephone operator by now. Or if banks hadn't learned how to clear checks electronically, we'd all be subjected to bank exchanges. But education just hasn't kept pace at all with the technological and informational revolution that characterizes the rest of our economy. Again, something we can talk about. Should there be a greater substitution of capital for labor? Maybe we'll have time to talk about it. The teacher-pupil ratio, and this isn't necessarily the size of classrooms, that's where we always get in trouble. The teacher-pupil ratio over the last 30 years, or 35 years, has become ever more favorable. And from a time when I was in school, where it was routinely 25 students per teacher, today the national average is about 15 students per teacher. Now this is an average figure. You're certainly going to encounter classrooms where there are more pupils than that, and you will encounter some, particularly in special education circumstances, where there are even fewer students than 15. So dollars have gone up, spending's gone up. We've hired more people. Pupil-teacher ratios have become more favorable, but this is just one sampling of 9, 13, and 17-year-old achievement. It's fundamentally plateaued. Now, that's a little bit of an overstatement. It's plateaued certainly for 17-year-olds, for those seniors. And if you look at the 3rd grade and the 8th grade, you'll see, this is mathematics, you'll see it's gone up somewhat, but it certainly hasn't gone up proportionate to the flow of resources to this undertaking. So that's where I stop and ask the first question, what is it? Why is education so apparently impenetrable to improvement when the resources have been there? What stops it from being more productive somehow? What is it? One other observation about performance, and then we'll move on. I'll try to address the question I posed. I can't answer it. But here, for most states, is a ranking of how many of their youngsters are judged to be proficient in mathematics by virtue of their state test, relative to how many are judged proficient by the national examination, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card, which is the only uniform appraisal of pupil achievement we have across the nation. When you look at this overall set of bar graphs, what you see is that state tests tend to rate students at a far higher rate of proficiency than do the nationally norm test. Missouri is right here in the center, and what you see, Missouri, now Mike Podgorski, I'm sure correctly informs me that Missouri has realigned its examination so that it is consistent with the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So the rather huge gap that one sees here for Missouri would no longer be the case. But up until that time, Missouri was a state where the differential between national proficiency and state-determined proficiency was about as high as it could get. Oh, well, not that. Okay, I apologize, but I'm glad it's fixed, whatever the problem was. Oh, that was Michigan is MI, right? So, okay. What prevents these resources from being translated somehow more effectively into student learning? There's not just one answer to this, but over the last 50 years, while these resources have been increasing, one of the preoccupations of the policy system has been on litigation. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to characterize the last half century of education finance, it's really not so much about legislative action as it is about judicial decisions. In the early 1960s, consistent with the civil rights movement, an artful crafting of a constitutional argument by a set of scholars both at Berkeley and at Northwestern, a set of scholars constructed a legal theory under the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, which gave leverage to a means for suing states for the substantial expenditure disparities which then existed. And they were substantial. I know Texas in 1970, the highest spending district in Texas was spending 25 times, I know it's so high it's unimaginable, the highest spending district in Texas was spending 25 times more per pupil than the lowest spending district in Texas. Now that's at the extremes, and not in other states you wouldn't find such extreme measures, but they did exist. And the application of this constitutional logic actually eventually has to be pursued through state constitutions, not the federal constitution. But when its final application through state constitutions, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to some lesser degree today, plaintiffs were remarkably successful in diminishing, if not eliminating, in diminishing the disparities in per pupil resources across school districts within states. So successful that today the major spending disparities are not within states, they are across states. From Mississippi to Connecticut and New Jersey is a far greater expenditure disparity than within Missouri, for example, or even within Mississippi. So the equal protection, the equity, the pursuit of spending equity appear to have been vastly justified because the quality of your schooling, if you were a child, the quality of your schooling could very easily be a function of wealth, local wealth, or even your household wealth. And for the most part, that's been dampened. It hasn't been eliminated, but it's one of the legal strategy success stories. In the late 1980s, the equity movement morphed and moved away from spending disparities into something that came to be known as the adequacy movement. Here, the determination was not that District A was spending more than District B. The determination was that neither District A nor B spent enough, and that relative to what was needed, there was an inadequate supply of resources. And therefore, children, in some manner, were being damaged. Initially, this was a very successful legal strategy. Courts were attracted to it. More recently, it appears to have run its course, with decisions favoring the defense, states, not plaintiffs, with decisions favoring the state now in Massachusetts, in effect in New York, in South Carolina, in Kentucky, for that matter, at least at the trial in Missouri, Alaska, we can go on and on, but the courts are less and less looking favorably upon the argument of there's not enough being spent. Why? It's a very difficult question to answer about what ought to be spent. Testifying in Wyoming, I remember a judge stopping me and saying, well, Professor Guthrie, you mean you can't tell me what's spent in the 4th grade? I said, Your Honor, I can tell you what Wyoming spends for 4th grade students. That's easy. That's an accounting challenge. What's more difficult is what should Wyoming spend in the 4th grade? I don't know the answer to that, and frankly, neither does anyone else. And so the courts have begun to accept the argument that in the absence of technical knowledge and technical certainty about what ought to be spent, that they are more likely or increasingly returning to this being a legislative decision, that this is a deliberative body that gets to make that judgment. So over the last 50 years, the political system writ large, in a way, has expended much more energy and attention on litigation than it has on any serious design of a education reform strategy that would elevate student learning. The courts have been the dominant factor for the last half century. I think that's diminishing. As a consequence of this disbalance, this disparity of attention toward legal matters, the United States has not had a balanced, coordinated, or really a full measure of an education reform portfolio. There's just not been a systematic attention to it. Some will say, and somebody in the audience might be thinking, well, what about No Child Left Behind? Isn't that an exemplar of a sustained, coordinated reform strategy? And I would say it's an exemplar of an accountability strategy. I think probably a bad one for reasons we can debate. But it is certainly, No Child Left Behind did not carry with it means or knowledge or practices that local school districts or school practitioners could use to elevate student achievement. It was a black box, is a black box endeavor, which assumes that if subjected to sufficient criticism, because there are very few rewards in it, but if subjected to sufficient criticism, that somehow flogging will continue until morale improves. That's what it's like. We have had the mother of all education reform documents in the latter part of the 20th century was the publication of A Nation at Risk. We can go through the history of it, but we'll bypass that for the moment. I refer to this as the document wherein seldom has a report been so wrong and have done so much good. The criticism was that the United States, educational achievement in the United States was falling and that other nations were about to take us over. There was no evidence in the report that achievement had fallen. It hadn't. And of course, all the scares about Japan taking us over just any day, or France, or et cetera, have not proven accurate. But Nation at Risk, nevertheless, triggered the modern era of education reform. You can almost draw a line between A Nation at Risk and No Child Left Behind, and a string of education reform efforts in between. After A Nation at Risk was issued in 1983, what you saw was the harvesting of a great deal of low-hanging fruit, some of which worked. Textbooks were made more rigorous. High school graduation standards were elevated. College admission standards were elevated. Homework was increased in every place but Santa Cruz, California, where the school board said eliminated homework, made it, you couldn't have homework because it was unfair to the students who didn't do very well, that the able students had homework and then got even better. So the answer to that was to eliminate homework. And a school board member said in a famous speech that he knew that homework made children ill. But we did harvest a lot of low-hanging fruit then. The intent was to make schools more rigorous. A California legislator said to me during that time, and he said, Guthrie, I don't care what bill you write. I don't care what reforms you have. Just make the little buggers work harder. And that's what got played out. And to a small degree it worked. There was a jump in achievement at that time. Then later, in the late 1980s and the 1990s, we went through, and are still in, what's called the standards movement. This followed the 1989 summit at Charlottesburg, Virginia, convened by George Herbert Walker Bush, where the third time in American history all the nation's governors were convened, and they agreed, frankly, in a stunning amount of concurrence, and a set of 6 national goals for American education. Now, they turned out to be aspirational, but they nevertheless were very important as a symbol. The first one was, of course, that one of the most important ones. The second one was that America will be first in math and science by the year 2000. We missed that one. But these goals, however hollow they might look historically, actually they weren't hollow because they inspired states. And state after state in the last 20 years, every state actually, save Iowa, every state has adopted a set of learning standards. And in most places, there's a set of standardized tests or comprehensive standardized tests which appraise student movement toward the achievement of those goals. So the argument of the standards and the alignment and accountability movement is if you can just get all the parts moving together, if you can get the expectations lined up with what the textbooks contain, and if the textbooks will contain what teachers are trained to teach, and then if the tests capture that appropriately, and if the professional development of teachers is appropriate to those standards, then the system will get better. And it's one of there's no proof of this, but it is altogether logical that it would seem like a good thing to do almost no matter what. That has been, this alignment strategy has been the privileged contemporary education reform portfolio. That's what we have depended on for over a quarter of a century to move our schools forward. There were alternative or competing strategies which did not get a comparable day in the legislative arena. One of which various kinds of market incentives or performance pay for teachers or schools, and another would have been more competition through charter schools or vouchers. We've had a sprinkling of all of that, I understand. And in the performance pay arena, quite a large sprinkling at present, though it's not clear how long this will last. It may be a short-lived fad. But approximately 20% of the school districts in the United States now have legislative inducements to have performance pay for their teachers. This is not always instead of the conventional single salary schedule. It is often in addition to, but it is certainly a vastly different world than what used to exist 5 or 10 years ago. So very little attention to markets and incentives in any reform strategy, and research and development that you'd think would be an important element when you have so much uncertainty characterizing the system. There's a great deal of craft knowledge out there among teachers. About that I have no doubt. And all of us can point to teachers who really are marvelous instructors. That's not up for grabs in my book. But the scientific basis for that is just not there. It's almost always individualized, experiential, it's craft. It can be conveyed, but it's not easily conveyed, and it is seldom conveyed in a scientific way through an education training program. So research and development, I think, is vastly neglected over what any rational model would hold. So we've not had any kind of national vision or a national strategy ever since A Nation at Risk pointed out our dangers, or ever since 1954 with the historic decision in Brown versus Board of Education, where you'd think we would be very interested in closing achievement gaps between poor and middle-class children or children of any particular race. We've never really had a national strategy here. Now you can say, well, education's not mentioned in the Constitution. There's no mention of schooling in the U.S. Constitution. So how can we have a national system? I'd point out that most of our economic competitors do have a national system. Few places, only Australia actually could even be in the ballpark, maybe Canada. Only a few nations could even come close to us in our decentralized pattern of schooling and school decision making. my explorations of why the Constitution is silent. I don't have a definitive answer. I defer to judges and attorneys present. But I do know it's in 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was convened, of the 12 colonies or states that are eventually to sign the Constitution, 7 of them already had a constitutional clause in which the colony or the state, call it what you want, took a statewide responsibility for schooling. So for the majority of those representatives convened in Philadelphia, the decision had already been made that schooling was a colonial or a provincial or a state decision, not a federal government decision. And anybody who wanted the federal government to play in it, after all, there was a general welfare clause they could use that. So we have these centrifugal forces in our history which push education decisions out to states and in substantial measure out to the approximate 14,000 local school districts in the United States. So when you get that kind of decentralization coupled with technical uncertainty about what to do, then you're in a tough spot to have a national system or any kind of uniform system. There are some centripetal forces today, and I'll touch upon them. There's some things pushing decisions toward the center with greater frequency. They're textbook publications, test manufacturing, for example, or No Child Left Behind. These are all counter examples of ways in which we're sort of pushing toward, groping toward, but haphazardly moving toward a national system. It's hard for me to believe that in the short run, by which I mean the next 10 years, maybe 15 years, I cannot easily imagine that in the next decade, it's not going to be easy to develop any kind of national strategy to make our schools better. It's just so vexatious. It's so fraught with conflicts. There are very important value issues concerned here, not the least of which is which level of government ought to be making decisions about this. The purpose of schooling, there are those who claim, and I think with some substantial legitimacy, that No Child Left Behind has been deficient in the manner in which it has narrowed the school curriculum, and that fine arts and creative matters and literature have gotten pushed out, while the testing pressure has been on math and reading and increasingly on science. So that the federal government has actually furthered the damage done to our system by narrowing the curriculum. So there are big political issues. I mentioned previously the absence of any very much empirical research that could guide us. If you want to turn to really stringent research, the best you can do is to hang your hat on the Tennessee Star study, proclaiming that in the elementary grades there appears to be some advantage to student achievement of having small classes. But even that can be debated. And for those who believe that preschool is the absolute answer to enhancing the achievement of youngsters, even that can be debated. There's very few clear-cut answers to all of this. I mentioned progressive era structural impediments to citizen engagement. There's not a time for a history lesson about the 1920s and 30s, but we undertook many political structural reforms at that time, which really give the upper hand to professional educators in the determination of the direction of our public schools. And it's very difficult for citizens to. I'll give you one example. In the 1920s, there was one school board, elected school board member in the United States for about every 200 citizens. Today, there's one elected school board member for about every 8,000 citizens nationwide. When I was a school board member in Berkeley, California, if we had divided the 5 school board members into the population, presumably I represented 30,000 people. Now, it didn't even work that way. And then this political economic micro-decoupling. The transaction costs are so high for a citizen to be informed about education policy that most of the time, except when the issues are made remarkably simple, like what the tax rate will be, or what your taxes will be, Except when the issues are remarkably simple, it's very difficult for the public to engage. The consequence is that the decision-making apparatus vastly favors those who are organized, which are either special interest groups or teachers' unions or educators themselves. So the system, the political responsiveness of our entire system is not good when it comes to education. There are lots of ways to break up any reform momentum. I'm going to bring this to a close quickly here. One might say, well, Guthrie, is there any hope? Why don't we just go slit our throat now? Let's forget it. Actually, change is possible. And what happens in today's schools, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. They are different in important ways we could go into. But I want to bring and so there's an element of optimism to all of this. I want to bring your attention to these asterisks here about reform efforts that actually have left a legacy. They have a footprint left still. Now, the progressive era depoliticization I already referred to, but for 90 years now, this cumbersome political structure around which we make school decisions has persisted, and it was a consequence of a coordinated reform effort. Common schools, which we sort of invented over most nations, where everybody attends school together and we don't stream off or cream off elites. The common school, starting big in the 1930s and 40s, has lasted for the most part. I'm not saying how successfully. School district consolidation has certainly taken place. Once there were 127,000 school districts in the United States. Now there are about 14,000. That has continued in a way. Racial desegregation, again, I won't speak to its effectiveness, but it's a place where judicial intervention was remarkably successful on balance. The School Mathematics Study Group, those of you who know about the math wars know how important that was at one time. It's completely gone. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, I've made mention of it here. It came in the 1960s. It's with us. It's one of the great technical ways forward we've had. And education finance equity, I think, whereas the movement's pretty much exhausted, it was remarkably successful. And the education standards and alignment have certainly been successful. So I'd like you not to leave thinking the whole system is impenetrable and nothing can ever be done. There's a chart here which I will not explain, go into, but if you can look at American education reform in the 20th century and see there are a number of places where reforms actually stuck, and schools today are different as a consequence of them. What I would leave you with is the prospect that you can construct a national educational policy. There are ways to do that, and on some past occasions it's even been done. And you can do this without relying on the federal government. There are components that are needed. One does need a champion for it. You do need a lot of national conferences and national networks. You have to use the media over and over and over, and you have to have this sustained commitment to doing it. But the most recent example, or a forceful example I can provide you of this, is with the education finance equity movement starting in the 60s, directed by the Ford Foundation for the most part, that coordinated suits across the states and had this substantial effect. So if one thought that there was a way in which American education ought productively to be altered, there are ways in which you can organize the effort and actually get underneath it. The one thing I would mention in this regard is I think there is so much uncertainty about how youngsters learn and how effective teachers teach that if I were the czar here, what I would design is a continuous learning system. Something that I've learned from the engineers label it fast failure. And you try as many experiments as you possibly can and capture the consequences of them and try to have a feedback loop that enables you to change and alter your system. I've spoken longer than I had intended to, for which I apologize, and in the process may have alienated virtually all of you. Thank you, nevertheless.
I should mention that there was a conference on school finance at the University of Missouri Columbia 6 months ago, and a lot of what Jim's remarks are in a paper, which is on the website at the Show Me Institute. So there's a series of papers from the conference, including this, which will come on a special issue of the journal. Question, comment? Sir.
This manual here is 337 pages. It's the accounting manual for all school districts in the state of Missouri. We have 524 school districts in the state. There's only about 180 that have over 1,000 students. People outstate know their school very well. It's even put into their newspapers, everything that goes on. Here in the city, we need to have school-by-school accounting, so we can actually tell, because many times we said, we don't know where this is going, we don't know where this is going. Well, even the unions, you know, you mentioned unions many times, they don't know where it's going either. Okay, we had a superintendent here at the last meeting of this group, and she said something that was contradictory to the Attorney General. The Attorney General said only 37% of the money going to instruction. She said, for every dollar that comes into the city, we're talking about the city. Okay, we're talking
that
about
might be
city.
different. That might be different.
Okay, so what we're trying to do is trying to get school-by-school accounting. And so we can actually see, you know, in the neighborhoods where this money is actually going.
Well,
and are we getting the best out of it?
You're preaching to the choir. I absolutely concur. I've been, all my professional life, I've been arguing for what Margaret Thatcher accomplished very quickly by just jamming the money on through the school district into the school with an appropriate amount left over for purposes of coordination, economy of scale, that sort of thing. But until such time as we get school-by-school accounting, such as Florida almost has, pretty close. Until we get that, I concur with you, we're not going to know for what we spend the money, and we're not going to get the feedback loop that enables us to make this whole thing more scientific. It's an important step forward. I absolutely agree.
Can I say who you are, if you don't mind?
Excuse me?
Who you are?
My name's Lon Zimmerman. I was curious, with all the programs that you outlined that deal with education, and yet you pointed out that there's a lack of empirical research on what has a positive impact on education. Why? Why aren't schools such as Vanderbilt, Peabody College, and other colleges of education looking into that task?
Yeah. That's a terrific question, and I'm pleased that you asked it. I think Vanderbilt's a rare exception where it's the faculty promotion actually is built around a performance pay system that rewards you for undertaking empirical research to a high standard. But that is not, of the 3,000 schools of education in the United States, that's not typical. Most of them are caught up in far more of a social justice agenda based in philosophy or social philosophy than they are an empirical agenda. Actually, the standard, I apologize if I offend you or anyone else in the audience, it's just my view of it is, the quality of research that takes place in most all of the schools of education in the United States is of such a low order that they just ought to be closed. And there's no hope, actually, because this is one of those places where low standards breeds lower standards. And I just don't know how to move that system. The Institute for Education Sciences in Washington, D.C. has brought about the most powerful transformation of educational research I've ever seen in this nation. It's done it in 5 years, and it's by picking out places that do undertake empirical research. They're often not ed schools, looking in departments of economics or sociology, other places, where there is a tradition of science and experimental research. That's taking place. It's generally not in ed schools, and it's being led by, interestingly, federal government officials more than anybody else.
Yeah, I would add that they're making use of randomized clinical trials. You see, you know, the same methods used in medicine to begin to develop a body of research that is telling us what works and what doesn't.
I think that fear drives a lot of decision making, and I guess the question I would have is that this country has the largest per capita population in prison than anybody in the world. Is there a relationship between that condition or status and our education system? And I don't know if there is or there isn't, but I think there must be something. And if there is, why doesn't that in general drive some fear to deal with the cultural attitudes, conservative, liberal, empirical, non-empirical, to make us confront in some way some of the issues that you've outlined here today? When will we gain fear that if our education system doesn't improve, that our social condition is continually going to decline?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific observation. I compliment you. For Mr. and Mrs. average voter in the United States, the prisoners to whom you refer, I think, are mostly invisible. Look where the prisons themselves are, for the most part. I think the point you drive is more likely to come home and be forcefully made and effective when Mr. and Ms. Middle Class America realize that their pensions and retirements are in jeopardy by virtue of the lack of productivity in the workforce. That may hit harder. I don't know. I'm not dismissing your observation about incarceration. It just seems like it's seldom. If you look at any one of the three presidential candidates in the moment, I don't know that any of them have said very much about fear of the consequence of incarceration.
I don't want to make this last one, and we can chit-chat afterwards. Go ahead.
My name is Karen Kalish, and I think we learned through Walter Annenberg throwing money at schools doesn't necessarily help. In fact, it could hinder things. But I don't see how any discussion about schools can be held without discussing the family structure, poverty, what's going on in our urban areas, the fact that young people in urban areas come to school knowing 500 words, and most of us in this auditorium came knowing 6,000 words, and all those issues and problems that are occurring. And I don't see how there could ever be a national policy when you've got kids attaining up here and being in school systems where they spend $15,000 per kid and $7,000 per kid, and not having the people in place who know how to spend those dollars. So there's a lot of, I found, with no disrespect, Professor, I found a lot of things lacking from this conversation that I think has to be in any conversation about education.
Well, I'm sure you're right about that, and I'm not offended. And but to your larger point, that what children bring to school with them counts so much, and the school has so little leverage over it, I don't have any disagreement with that. Now, how to fix it, I'm not sure. There were times in the past where social programs proved to be as inefficient as schools. So how to do that which you want is not an empirically easy question to answer either. Or what I impute that you would like to help these youngsters. I agree with that.
Well, so thank you for your presence here, and we can continue the discussion outside.
Thank you.
Well, on behalf of St. Louis University and the Sherman Institute, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And I'd like to thank Jim Dutch especially for taking the time to come down here and talk to us today. It was interesting to hear you talk, and I hope you'll come back sometime in the future and we can continue this discussion. Thank you very much.